I want to talk about just a few issues, and Istvan has touched on some of the material that I was going to talk about, so I'll try to run through that very quickly. Just want to talk a little bit about the size of the Irish state and how it's evolved, and just to talk about some structural issues that are relevant. Talk about the fiscal consolidation path and some aspects of the consolidation. Maybe to touch on our perspective within the system about how we've gone about this. And I was interested in the debate already we've had about how progressive the path has been and the adjustment has been. Our view, based on the evidence that we have, is that it's been a highly progressive consolidation path. Difficult, necessary, but progressive, based on the information that we have. I'm looking forward to Tim's new research on this. I'll talk about some issues for the future, the challenges. There are many challenges. I could spend an hour talking about the challenges we face. I'm sure we all could in this room, but I only have a few minutes, so I'll touch on a few of them. And again, speaking as a humble economist, macroeconomist like Istvan, but also with some micro experience as well, perhaps, and maybe some concluding comments. Also, the size of the state, we can measure it in many ways. General government expenditure is the widest measure we have, and I hope these graphics are clear. If not, most of them are included in the article. The widest measure of general government spending that we have, including the volume of services plus costs of servicing the debt, and the costs and servicing the debt have increased naturally as the stock has gone up, and this is an important factor. But in terms of the size of the state, in the pre-crash period, before 2008, 2009, for about 8-9 years, it was averaging around early to mid-30s as a percent of GDP. It spiked very dramatically, and some of these expenditures include one-off banking, and we can see it's now come down. I think it's important political economy question, probably the most important political economy question we need to face over the next number of years, is the size of the state, and what is the appetite of the Irish taxpayers to fund this level of spending or some different level. And a lot of our focus, I think, a lot of the debate, particularly over the next number of years as we face another election, should be about these issues of purely political at the size of the state. It's interesting to look at that portion of spending which is focused on goods and services provided by the state and capital. And this dashed line at the top looks at the volume of spending, in effect excludes EU transfers, costs associated with servicing the stock of debt. And it's interesting to see how the share was around 25% or so, a little bit higher, of GDP in the period before the crash. So the volume of services as a proportion of GDP by 25%. So that's how much of the resources we were taking. And it increased very dramatically during the recent period. And it's now down on a very significant downward trajectory. And again, it's heading back towards, but still higher than the average that pertained before the downturn. So again, the key political economy question is the extent of further reduction in this and the appetite of the taxpayers to fund that level or a given level of public services. Of course, how we spend our money, the vast majority of our money, 80% of spending, is on health, education and social protection, 80% of what we spend. And that share has gone up over the last number of years as we prioritise those areas of expenditure, and because of limited resources, allocations to other areas have been reduced. I think that's very important in discussing consolidation and measures to reduce the size of the state, that it's very difficult to do it without reducing spending on key core areas because they account for such a large proportion of our activity. Presenting it in a different way, what does the public service do? We employ people. The pay and pensions bill is a significant part of our spending, as one can see, and social transfers are also other significant part of it. So tax and transfer, employ public servants and buy goods and services and build things is in essence what the state does. It's useful, and many in the audience will be aware of this. Look, taking the historical sweep and look back from the 1950s to where we are in 2010, the size of the state as a proportion of spending. And in effect, in the 1950s and 60s and the early 70s, we didn't have a developed welfare state. We didn't have significant spending on public education or public health, and the shares have increased dramatically over time. I think a very important point to make is, despite the severity of the recession and the economic shock and the necessary adjustment, that most of the gains that we built up during the good period have been retained in terms of the level of social provision. And certainly in a comparative historical context, that's the case. Fiscal consolidation and what we've done, Istvan has touched on this. I won't go through it in detail. Very significant crash, whichever indicator you want to pick, GMP, GDP, real nominal, whichever way you want to look at it, a very significant fall. and the economy now is back to the size it was in 2004, 2005, and a decline in activity probably without precedent for an advanced industrialised economy. I think Finland in the late 80s, early 90s perhaps was comparable, and Latvia recently, but really a very unique event in historical and comparative terms. The impact on the labour market was severe, as we've discussed, very significant reductions in employment and a very significant increase in unemployment. Interesting, though, to look at the numbers that over the last 3 years, employment levels have stabilised and we haven't seen further reductions, and unemployment peaked and is now starting to fall, obviously at a very high level, and very significant youth unemployment and very significant long-term unemployment, and obviously concerned about the social and structural implications of that. But in terms of the labour market, things stabilised a number of years, stabilised at a level in terms of unemployment, which obviously is too high, but we are making some progress, as Istvan mentioned. In terms of the fiscal and the fiscal balance, economists, of course, have many different ways of measuring this, need to say, and couldn't produce a very simple chart showing what went on. But we have one which is a little bit complex. The key indicator here, I think, is the primary balance, the fiscal balance excluding debt servicing costs, and that's the dash line, as you see there. And that peaked at 10% of GDP in 2009, 2010. So that was the worst year, excluding bank-related costs and excluding interest costs on the debt. And for 2014, for next year, the expectation, the forecast is that will be imbalanced. So we have reduced the primary deficit by 10 percentage points over this period. And that doesn't account for the full amount of the effort, because there are many pressures increasing spending. So the actual fiscal effort to reduce the deficit by 10 percentage points has been greater than that. So a very significant period of consolidation. We could argue about the pace of this consolidation. Should we have gone faster? Should we have slowed down? We could argue about how progressive. But it's certainly a very significant adjustment with very significant implications for society and for the public finances. My own view is this was absolutely necessary. A deficit of that level, given growth rates and given the cost of our funds and the stock of our debt, was unsustainable. And we have managed to reduce it. And I think in a sustainable way, which gets the debt to now a level which we could accommodate, while also minimising where possible the impact on the labour market and the economy. But a very significant reduction, and next year is a very significant milestone that the primary deficit is reduced and we have a primary balance for the first time. It's interesting looking back at the conduct of fiscal policy during the good years, because a lot of debate about this, that we should have had tighter policy, and yes, perhaps we should have done, but during the good years, we still ran primary surpluses, quite considerable primary surpluses, like from 91 up to 99, 2000, we had primary surplus of 5% of GDP. Now, myself and Istvan back then would have agreed that was sufficiently prudent, but obviously we were mistaken, given our incorrect review about the sustainability of the fiscal position. During that period, we underestimated, and through the 2000s, we underestimated the extent to which the economy was benefiting from temporary endowment, a temporary boost. But it is interesting to see how, on the face of it, fiscal policy looked to be appropriate and prudent, but obviously the crash had a major impact on the sustainability. In the paper, I've set out in some detail tables setting out the different components of the adjustment and what part of the system have borne the greatest amount of the burden. I think it's very important to set out at the start that the spending on social protection has increased significantly. And we believe that the social safety net has done its job in, where possible, mitigating the worst impacts of the very significant reduction in private demand. And if you look at the impact of the incredible reduction in private demand, and then look at the impact accounting for social welfare spending, we have managed to mitigate that to an incredible degree, and Istvan produced numbers on various effectiveness of the system. But I think it's important to set out that the amount of resources devoted has increased, and at a time when we've had to reduce back budgets very significantly elsewhere. I think it's also useful within health, and think about the debate we have on the health budget, that non-pay expenditure on the health services has actually increased. That the vast bulk of the reductions in health spending have been on pay, unit costs, they have been on drug costs, despite obviously the need for us to do better on there. And when you actually look at it, non-pay spending has increased during that period. And we've managed to accommodate very significant pressures in terms of medical cards. As you can see, very significant increase in the number of medical cards, and also very significant increase in the demand for the acute system, given the demographic profile that we have. Education, likewise, in education, again, contrary to what one would think, reading some of the analysis and certainly reading some of the commentary, the government have managed to sustain the allocations on non-pay spending within the publicly funded education system. And we've managed to sustain a reasonable volume of service when we've increased the number of students by 75,000 in the primary and secondary system, and also increased the numbers in third level education. So again, the message is that we have managed to sustain a reasonable level of service, increase the volume of service when taking significant resources out of the system. So the consolidation effort, clearly a part of it has been the public sector pay bill. 3 cuts in pay rates for public servants over 65,000, across the board reductions in overtime, and allowances in a variety of different payments, and we've reduced numbers. And again, in terms of reducing numbers, we haven't reduced the numbers of teachers. In actual fact, the number of people, teachers in the system has actually increased, and we haven't reduced frontline staff within the health system. So we've managed to reduce numbers by squeezing management grades, by squeezing admin and back office where possible. And I think when people look back on this consolidation, they will say the government were very successful in focusing the adjustment in those areas would have least impact on service delivery. So the consolidation effort, obviously outside social welfare, health and education, there has been a dramatic reduction in nearly everything else that the government does across a whole variety of different areas, a very significant reduction, and we'd obviously reduced capital spending by a significant amount. Our own view is that the capital spend reduction was necessary because the demands on the supply of infrastructure were reduced as the economy had a different profile. So we had an expectation of the economy continuing to grow by 2 or 3%, and that would have required an increase in infrastructure provision on the scale that we'd anticipated. But obviously we had a different growth path has materialised, and now we have different expectations. So the actual supply requirements on public infrastructure are very, very different. So overall then, in terms of the effort, I think this is very important, and it's lost in some of the media commentary, is that public service pay and capital and other programmes have taken the brunt of the adjustment, that we've actually increased resources on social protection and maintained where possible expenditure, non-pay health and education. So I'm obviously somewhat biased, but I think this consolidation, while difficult, was probably close to as good as we could do in the circumstances. But I know people may disagree with that. The future, in terms of where we go, and I'll talk about some of the challenges. There are many challenges, and I could spend many hours this morning talking about them if Michael would allow me, but time is against us. Obviously, the fiscal rules, the fiscal constraints. We're in the excessive deficit procedure now, and we need to reduce the deficit further. And even when we get to that position, of course, we need to move towards a medium-term objective of a balanced budget and move to a higher primary surplus to improve the overall stock of debt, which is still too high. And within that, those constraints have implications for spending, limits on spending, and how those limits are linked to the overall capacity of the economy to grow. So while we're out of the Troika programme, and that's welcome, I think that's a very important milestone in terms of our recovery, we're obviously now an ordinary member of the Eurozone with the requirements that come with that membership. I think it's very important, even if we weren't in the EU semester, even if we didn't have those constraints, I think the largest constraint we face is that we have a large stock of debt, and we now have a much more vigilant bond market. And even if Istvan and his colleagues in the Commission weren't doing their job, I think the bond market will do its job for us. We have this stock of debt, and we're vulnerable to further shocks, and we need, as quickly as possible, bring it to a more sustainable level. And that requires us to run primary surpluses and keep the interest cost on our debt as low as possible, and hope that economic growth will help. So the 3 issues here, the 3 factors: primary surplus, the cost of our funds, and growth in nominal GDP. And they're the determinants of our debt dynamics and how quickly we can reduce this stock of debt. And this, I think, is absolutely imperative for fiscal policy, that we bring this to more sustainable levels over time. A key part of the challenge that we will face will be to manage spending more effectively. We believe we've put in place now a much more sophisticated approach to spending public money. We have a medium-term spending framework where we don't just have a discussion every budget about 1 year, we have a discussion about 3 years, and we set envelopes on a 3-year basis. And this allows the system to plan much more effectively how we use public resources. We have comprehensive reviews of spending every 3 years, and we're going to commence a new one now at the beginning of 2014, where we stand back and look at the pressures, look at the challenges, and try to set out envelopes for the coming period. We have much more evaluation and assessment of what we're doing, and we placed a much greater emphasis on performance information. And if you look at our website, our department's website, if you look at the revised estimates volume, there's much more information, not just on the amount of money we spend, but also on what we're trying to achieve in terms of impact indicators and the value for that spending. So we're trying to have a much more sophisticated debate and discussion about how we use public funds. A lot of the time we talk about the volume, and certainly in discussions or media commentary around the budget, there's a discussion about, are we taking the budget down by $1 billion or $1.5 billion? But of course we need to focus on the other 50 billion that is still there, and are we spending that as efficiently as possible? And I think as part of this, we need to focus on reforming the public sector. What can we do to make the system more open, transparent, efficient and effective, and to look at new models of service delivery and be open and creative about how we're providing services, to look at new ways, to pilot new ways, to ensure that we're learning from other countries and learning from our own experiences in terms of how we provide services across the board. A key priority, obviously, for the future where we are now is to promote growth. Obviously, we're a small open economy. Most of what we produce, we export. Most of what we consume, we import. The most open within the union. So growth and our potential to grow, a lot of it is dependent upon what happens in our main trading partners. And there's some good news there in terms of the UK economy, very important for us, which I think is recovering very rapidly. The US is still doing okay. The rest of the world, obviously, within the Eurozone, it's a more mixed position. So the context for our capacity really depends on our ability to compete and what happens within our main trading partners. There is a role for macro policy. My own view, and others may disagree with this, but my own view is that our focus should be on having a sustainable fiscal position, reducing the debt, and insulating where possible the economy from the potential for future economic shocks. Obviously, there are issues around banking system, and thankfully my department, it's the Department of Finance that looks after that, so I'll say nothing about banking. Thank God for certain things. There is a role, of course, for policy in terms of micro policy. So what can we do within our ambit of responsibility? What can we do? And Istvan touched upon some of this, and there's an EU dimension increasingly to issues around the youth guarantee, activation policy, ESF funding, so there's an EU dimension to this. But what can we do in terms of the state to stimulate activity and have the smartest possible policies? Are there more things we can do in terms of encouraging innovation? We spend a significant amount of money in terms of funding through Science Foundation Ireland and other initiatives. Is that money well spent? Competition policy, can we do more to reduce the cost of non-traded services through reforms of legal profession, medical and so on? Infrastructure, where we do spend, is it appropriately spent? Education, activation policies, do we have the best education system? Activation policies, can we do more? Can we tailor them more to the evolving labour market situation? And housing, I think this is an area where we really need to learn lessons from the boom. We built houses in the wrong places, weren't planned as part of sustainable communities with all the facilities communities need, health, education, transport links. So when we now have to start building houses, and we will have to start building houses in the Greater Dublin area, I think, how do we plan that? Where do we build? How do we link them into a sustainable spatial strategy? And I think this is a very important issue for debate, and one we need to debate more as a society. The labour market, we've had some growth for 2013. Unemployment has started to come down. It's a very high level, but we are starting to see, I think, increasing evidence, both in terms of the official statistics, but anecdotal evidence that things are starting to improve. But we need to do much more in terms of the youth guarantee, the action plan for jobs and pathways to work, to ensure that where we do have resources, they're focused on training and education that works for people, to enable them to re-enter the labour force and reach their potential. We will face a changing demographic, rapidly changing demographic, where we'll have a reduction in the working age population like other countries, not as severe as some of our other European countries, but still significant, while we have an increase in the population over 65. And we all know this will have major implications for pensions and for health spending. There is some work done which shows how over time age-related spending will increase significantly as a share of GDP, a share of our resources. And for many countries, probably including Ireland, in the absence of measures, policy responses, this is not sustainable. So we will have to have a proper debate about pensions, about long-term care, and about these issues. How do we fund long-term care? How do we provide the infrastructure? How we fund it, and the setting for it? So to conclude, one of the regrettable features of the boom time and what happened was that the public policy, including debate within the civil service, was infected by groupthink. That we all thought that while there are imbalances, we'd unwind them in an orderly way. We thought we'd have a soft landing. We thought the fundamentals, this time it was different, and so on. So I really do believe that it's very important for us to have an open debate and have different perspectives and different views, and for us to be challenged. I think that involves particularly the civil service being challenged. It involves the media. I think I've done well not criticising the media so far this morning, but I think it does involve the media engaging in a proper constructive way in debate, and not trivialising everything, not sensationalising everything, not treating politics or public policy as an extension of some soap opera. I think that's very important. And I think for us to have a debate on all these issues, we need to really have proper engagement through media and civic society and the political system on the choices that we face, because we do face significant choices and options as a country.